All right, welcome everybody to another IY recap video. This video is meant to recap week 9 of our 16 verses study. Over the last couple weeks, we've talked about God's covenants to his people, God's covenant to Adam and Eve, God's covenant to Abraham, God's covenant to Jacob and to Judah, and last week we covered God's covenant with David. This week we're going to talk about not necessarily a covenant, but more of a prophecy. When we talk about prophecy in the Bible, we talk about truths that the people speaking or writing these prophecies are looking forward to. So sometimes biblical prophecy is looking forward to something that's even further past our time, that hasn't yet been fulfilled. But sometimes biblical prophecy, we have the advantage of being able to look back on history and see how God has fulfilled the prophecies that he gave to his people. And so this week we're looking at the prophecy of the suffering servant in Isaiah chapter 53. We talked a little bit this week about kind of the context of Isaiah. And really what you need to know is that God's people, after King David, continually fell into sin. And that the royal lineage of David, the kings of Israel, were no better. That they often failed to lead the people well. That a lot of the time, the kings of Israel were not exactly role models for their people. We talked about that at one point in the history of Israel that the law is rediscovered, that it's read aloud to the people again for the first time in like 250 years. And so that leads us to kind of look at and see that there were 250 years where the people weren't being taught the law, right? That the people were not doing what they were supposed to be doing. And when we look at that in the context of the kind of sin problem that God's people have, this is only making it worse, right? That God's people, when they looked at the law, should have recognized that they can't keep the law and that the law can't save them. And so for them to really have their sin issue fixed, they need some bigger, greater sacrifice than they can currently provide. And when they're not even making the small sacrifices for hundreds of years, that really is only adding to the problem. And so eventually, when you look at the history of Israel, you'll see that the people are captured and taken away from the land of Israel and into Babylon, that they suffer as a result of their iniquity. But when we look at Isaiah 53, this takes place a little bit before then, and we see Isaiah looking forward to what he refers to as a suffering servant. And when we look at Isaiah 53, verses 5 through 6, we see that somebody is coming whom will be a servant of the Lord, but whom the Lord will pour out his wrath and his judgment on, so that this suffering servant could represent God's people and become a kind of substitutionary offering, that he would suffer on behalf of God's people, even though he wasn't really deserving of that suffering to begin with, that he would take the punishment that the people of Israel deserved. If you look at verse 10 in Isaiah 53, it says that he will become an offering for guilt. And so as the representative of the nation, he would step in and do what all of the sacrifices could never do. He would bring peace and healing, and he would absorb the sin and guilt of the nation, that he would bear the sins of many. And so one thing that we really kind of hit on was that we have to understand Isaiah 53 in the context of what we've been talking about, specifically in the context of Genesis 3:15. That Genesis 3:15 is looking forward to the seed of the woman who will ultimately crush the head of the serpent. And when we look at the other covenants that God makes with his people, that there's this kind of royal lineage that's coming forward that's been promised to Judah and then to David, that we can understand that this suffering servant, right, is that person in Genesis 3:15. That this suffering servant is going to be a member of the royal lineage of Judah and of David, that at the same time, his goal is not necessarily to just rule over the people, that this person that Genesis 3:15 and the rest of the Old Testament is looking forward to is going to be somebody who will suffer on their behalf and who will not only just offer up a perfect sacrifice, but he himself will be the perfect sacrifice for the sins of God's people. And so as we think through that, I have just a few discussion questions for you. One, these promises in in Isaiah 53 are certainly looking forward to Christ. But how does Jesus live up to those promises? Right? How does Jesus fit the role of the person that Isaiah 53 is looking forward to? Some other things to think about. Why do you think God gave this prophecy about Jesus to Isaiah? Right? Why was it important for Isaiah and the people of his time to understand that this suffering servant was coming for them? Another thing to think about, after reading the verse here in Isaiah 53, how do you think that God feels about sin? And how does your view of sin line up with how God sees it? And then the last thing just to be thinking about is, do you see yourself in Isaiah 53:6? Just kind of think through that. Do you see yourself reflected in these verses at all? So thanks for joining me. I hope to see you next week, and I'll talk to you later. Bye.